Bitcoin is close to becoming worthless.
Let's go. Now, what's the Bitcoin?
Bitcoin's like rat poison.
Yeah. Oh,
The greatest scam in history.
let's get it.
Bitcoin will go to fucking zero.
Alright, you ungovernable misfits. I'm your host, Max. Everybody knows that Bitcoin is useless, worthless, and doomed to fail. But what if everyone's wrong? What if it's the system that is doomed to fail? Join me as I speak to some of the brightest people in the space and slither to the deepest, darkest depths of the Bitcoin rabbit hole. Thanks for tuning in for another day of Pleb Miner Month. Today's guest is Gian Mendoza. I really enjoyed this episode. It was great to chat to him, and it was good just listening through again because we recorded this about a month ago. We have just so much content coming out, so many prizes, so do keep a lookout. Today we are going to be giving away an S9. Make sure to check Twitter to find out how to win this, and also make sure to go to ungovernablemisfits.com and check out all the content that we've got on there, all the articles, all the shows, and all the giveaways. I want to thank everyone who's been retweeting and using the hashtag PlebMinerMonth. It does help us get exposure, it helps people understand why pleb mining is so important, and make sure that people who would be interested don't miss this opportunity. I'd also like to thank everyone who has been streaming sats by the Podcasting 2.0 apps. It really does help us this month because every single sat will be going towards the postage and shipping for the prizes that we'll be giving away. It's great to have you guys communicate and ask questions, and please, we want more of it. We want everyone as involved and included as possible, so give us a shout and we will answer any questions that we can. I also want to thank Foundation Devices for sponsoring this show and also sponsoring this month. We're going to have Bitcoin Q&A and Lily on the show very soon. So if you have any questions about Foundation Passport, please do get them in and we will get them answered on the show. We're also going to be having 2 giveaways of Foundation Devices Passport, so make sure to look out for that. Do not miss that. These devices are absolutely incredible. If you just can't wait and you want to buy one of these now, you can on foundationdevices.com, and you can get an additional $10 off if you use the code BITBYBIT. If you haven't checked it out, go to foundationdevices.com, and if you have any questions at all, you can ask me or the team. I'd also like to thank Fast Bitcoins. They are an exchange based in the Isle of Man, and they have an awesome team. This team is so cool that they allow me to do this Pleb Mining Month, allow me to talk shit about KYC, and be as honest and open as possible. They really do care about Bitcoin, and they will do everything that they can to keep you safe if you do decide to use a KYC service. They were the first people to have Lightning integrated into their service, and they're always a step ahead. If you have any questions about the trade-offs with KYC versus non-KYC, you can reach out to me. And if you are going to go that route, I really can only suggest these guys. Go to fastbitcoins.com. Hey mate.
Can you hear me this time?
Yeah, I can hear you now, but you do sound a bit like you're down a well.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. I got let's see. I just switched it over to my head. I'm wearing my AirPods right now, but I'm not getting any audio. Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, it's not the world's best audio, but we'll work with it. I can do some fucking around and make it sound better. We will get there.
All right, man. Yeah, I'll have to invest into more gear.
But yeah, welcome to the show. We haven't spoken
Appreciate
before. I spoke to John and I said, look, can you gather me the plebbiest of all pleb miners, the people who really have their boots on the ground and are building the most interesting stuff out there? And you were right at the top of that list. So I've been looking forward to having a chat and seeing what you've been doing.
Appreciate it. No, I definitely feel honored to be a part of the pleb group he's got going on. John reached out to me about a month or so ago because I know he was going to do that conference with the crypto mining conference. But I know that kind of fell through for reasons I'm not too sure of. But nonetheless, I'm glad we still got something going with this group of plebs, and looking forward to contributing.
Yeah, well, it's really exciting for me because I'm not someone who's really dipped my toe into mining other than getting scammed by Compass. I've never managed to get a machine up and running. I've bought a couple of S17s years ago, back in like 2018, but I was too dumb to get them working, and I was living in a little studio flat, and they were just ridiculously loud and and didn't work. So I never managed to get myself set up, but it's been an itch I've been wanting to scratch for a long time. And as I've become better friends with John and some of the other more plebby miners, it's just becoming more and more apparent that more people need to be doing this. You've got so many of these huge warehouse miners and everything that's happening in North America, but I think it's important that this decentralizes and that people aren't so scared to dip their toe in, especially if they've got relatively decent power rates. And so I've been checking out your YouTube, and you've been documenting what you've been doing. And this is just what's so important, is so that people can see that, actually this is possible. This isn't something that's unachievable. And it seems that all of you guys, like, once you start getting involved with it, it becomes really like quite an obsession.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, it's just one of the many rabbit holes that you fall down when you get involved in Bitcoin. And I guess just a little bit about my background. I've been watching the space probably since about 2016, and finally got invested, more or less for the number go up factor back in 2016, early 2017. And from that point, it was more or less, the price was very interesting, but then you dig into the technical side of things and realize how fascinating the mining industry is. And back then I was interested in mining as well, but I was living in an apartment, just got out of college, and wasn't really feasible. And I think a lot of people are kind of going through that phase now, where you hear a lot about mining going on the industrial scale, both on the industrial scale and on the home mining side. And they don't realize how complicated it is once you do get involved. But once you dip your toes in, you get a miner hooked up, whether it's an S9 or if you just want to ball out and get an S17 for your first one. There's a lot more to it than just hooking up your miner. And as you mentioned with your experience with the S17, yeah, they're loud. You got to deal with the heat and the many difficulties that come with actually setting up the infrastructure to get these miners running, because they're not just running on your standard outlet. You need to run like 220, 240 in order for these machines to be efficient. And yeah, so once I finally got into the mining space, I fortunately, number went up. I got a house, started the whole family thing, but realized my garage was a little silent, so I decided to get a couple outlets hooked up, running some miners. And the funny thing is, as soon as I got my first S19 hooked up, about just over a year ago now, I turned it on, and my wife walks into the garage, she's like, "Turn it off!" Like that. It was just absolutely loud. There was no way that was going to be a sustainable solution in my house. And I live in an HOA too, so it's not like a lot of these guys, fortunately have a lot of land, or some of the guys that you follow on Bitcoin Twitter have a more I guess sustainable way of mining, whether you have a cooler environment or you're not in an HOA. But unfortunately, I'm in the dead heat of Arizona, and I'm in one of the most strict HOAs out there. So my solution was to first mitigate the noise issue. The mining, the heat extraction is relatively simple to solve. It's a matter of just getting a large fan, pulling enough air through your machines, and there you go. But the sound deadening is quite essential, and that was my first hurdle to kind of overcome. mainly because, happy wife, happy life. And I invested too much in the machine for it to just sit around or, send it off state lines to get hosted somewhere else. So that's kind of where that rabbit hole started. Got my first one hooked up, I want to say June of last year. And, there wasn't a lot of info out there as far as, especially with the S19s, those were fairly new, especially for us pleb miners. There wasn't a lot of video content or anything out there talking about how to even hook it up. I know there's maybe one or two guys on YouTube, but I figured why not record something, see what happens. So if others like me wanted to get involved, there's some content out there. And fortunately, it worked out. And, hopefully a lot of people learned, how to the basics of getting something set up in an air-cooled system like I did. And then eventually, go into an immersion system, which I have set up and torn down. And now I'm in the process of rebuilding again.
Obviously, where you are is relatively hot. What was that like, once you've managed to suppress the noise? Were you still like sweating as soon as you walked into your garage, or like how much of a difference did that make having a miner running?
Yeah, there was definitely instances where I had to run the miner and then I didn't realize how hot it would get. So I'd be shutting it back off. As a matter of fact, I think within the first week that I finally solved the noise issue, I was at work and I got a notification that my miner had shut off. And sure enough, it was probably 115 degrees outside, and it was one of those thermal overload settings that kind of triggered, and essentially the miner shut off. So, back to the drawing board. I wasn't, again, familiar too much with the equipment. It's kind of just going as learning as I go, and just doing some simple research on, what these bigger farms are doing, what some of these guys are doing with GPUs, because there's actually a decent amount of content with the GPU miners out there. And just adding a 16-inch exhaust fan, keeping my garage door cracked up a little bit, was enough airflow to keep the miners quiet or cool. So that was my solution for the air-cooled system. It's really basic. I mean, just throw a fan in, open your garage a little bit, and there you go. So fortunately with that, I had a relatively quieter miner home setup, and the air-cooled system was working just fine. However, once it does get past 110, 115, you do have to find other solutions, because even inside your garage with enough airflow, at the end of the day, the ambient operating temperatures of these miners, I believe Bitmain says on their specs, is about 104. So I was fortunate enough to still run them even up to 110, but on those, handful of days throughout the summer, it just still wasn't cutting it. So I ended up just putting a mini split unit in my garage. And I know a lot of guys out there are gonna be like, oh, that wasn't cost effective way to do it. I understand. But one of the things that, I had other reasons as to why I wanted to put a mini split in there to cool my garage. I like to do a lot of work on my truck and stuff like that. So it just made more sense at that time. But, you can go with an evaporative cooler or, an evap pad that runs, trickles water down like a porous surface. And that's one way to kind of cool your environment.
Doesn't it also affect the amount of hash rate you can put out? Like you can overclock or underclock depending on the temperature. So like, because I've heard a lot of people who are using immersion can get more juice out of these things because they're running cooler. Were you finding that was affecting your setup when it was running as hot as it was?
Yeah, well, when I initially got started, none of this firmware was even out yet. I think Coin Heated barely was becoming famous at that point. He's kind of an idol in this space as far as from a home miner setup. And at that time, there wasn't even any firmware, so I couldn't do any type of throttling down or throttling up with those S19s. So it was more or less, shutting it off remotely with I had a smart PDU, just abruptly shutting it off if it got too hot, and then shutting it back, turning it back on when it was cool enough. So pretty much, I was at that point not able to run on the hottest days, probably 4 or 5 hours at least of the day, which was quite a bit of inconvenient. But now there's a lot of solutions out there, and you have all these aftermarket firmwares from Brains to Vinish or Vinesh, however you want to pronounce that, that allow you to overclock and underclock. And it's great to overclock, especially in the cooler climates. You know, you can crank these things up to 130 terahashes on the stock PSU, no problem. And as far as underclocking, that's what I do now. So my whole process has evolved quite a bit since I first got started. During the past probably year or so, I've actually had a 22 kilowatt solar system installed on my house, which is extremely large compared to the amount of power draw that a typical home would be pulling. And when I had pitched this to my solar guy, he's like, "What? Why are you doing this?" And I'm like, "Well, I have these computers that just run 24/7." So we ended up working on the specs and put a 22 kilowatt system up there. And I originally sized that for just one miner, but just like everything in this industry, it's an addiction, and got another S19 in there, and yeah, I mean, the system works pretty well. So during peak hours, I have my miners throttled down, I underclock them, and so my solar system's overproducing, sells back the excess solar to the grid, which offsets my overall cost quite a bit. And then during off-peak hours, I ramp these miners back up to as high, as high as I can get them. Even during the evenings, it's still, high 90s, low 100s. So I can't, unfortunately, overclock them all the way to up to 130, but I can still get them up to like 110, 115, no problem. And now I'm, in the process of building out a immersion system that will utilize a cooling tower. So we'll see how that goes, but it's all DIY at this point, and hopefully I don't burn up a miner in the process.
That's really cool. So the solar system obviously will be running during the day with the machines underclocked. What do you do when the sun goes down? Do you have like big battery packs, or do you just literally switch over to mains? Like what's your setup doing there when the sun goes down?
Yeah, I considered doing the battery pack system, in combination with the panels. However, it just didn't seem cost effective. The cost to run a battery system that would take the entire load of these two S19s would be quite big, and the ROI on getting a battery pack set up to accommodate this just didn't seem like it would make sense. So I just sell back to the grid, and when the miner, the sun goes down, the miners just run strictly off of what's tied into the grid at that moment.
Do you guys have relatively decent grid power? Like, are the costs crazy where you are, or I mean, everything seems cheap to me. Being in the UK, we're paying like equivalent of about 45 cents a kilowatt.
Oh my god!
So yeah, it's like we just get raped. It's absolutely horrific. So that's why you'll hear a lot of the European mining plebs are like, how do we do that? They've got to find very clever ways of trying to offset the heat and doing all sorts of stuff to try and make this work. But from what I hear, it's like you kind of have to be 10 cents a kilowatt hour to think about being profitable. Are you guys managing to buy off the grid at less than that, or?
No, actually, I'm right at that threshold. So I average in probably around 10 cents a kilowatt hour during off peak. And then on peak, it ramps up to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's definitely not the cheapest out there. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to go with the solar system, because once it's during on peak, the solar system at that point is offsetting, the load to the grid. So I'm not really getting charged during those on peak prices. More or less, I'm actually selling back during that time. So it helps off quite a bit. And I think when I did the math, at the end of the day, it's about, with me selling back to the grid and running 24/7, while I also power down a little bit during the on-peak hours, I think I'm about just over 8.5 cents, maybe 9 cents now. But yeah, it's definitely hard to find, especially for us pleb miners, competitive rates if you're not in Georgia, Kentucky, Texas. It's really hard to do that. And I think that's what a lot of problems people are having right now is, it was all fine and dandy when Bitcoin was at $60,000, but now when you're barely mining, if you've had equipment on order for quite a while or been waiting to get the electrical infrastructure up and running, and then now prices where it's at, I think today we're around like 23,000, somewhere around there. It definitely is can be a little daunting at times because you're like, I just invested all this equipment. I don't have necessarily the best energy rate. Does this even make sense at this point? And I think a lot of people are going to go through that cycle right now, and hopefully, there's ways you can offset that by either recapturing the heat, or if it's just more of an altruistic kind of endeavor and you just want to be part of the network and mine no matter what the cost. And that's cool too. Non KYC sats are always great, and I think there's going to be a premium to that at some point. But that's kind of the risk you got to take. Especially if you don't have the most competitive energy rates.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit because that's definitely a theme with this show is privacy and trying to acquire KYC sats and the importance of it. And so this is something that I say to a lot of people, especially the European plebs who are thinking about mining is, yes, it could potentially be for some of us more cost effective just to go on a Coinbase or equivalent and go and hand over all your information and they keep that on file and you buy your sats and you never know who's going to knock at your door. You never know what's going to happen in the future, and you are going to be tracked and traced for the rest of your life, most probably. And certainly there's a record that you bought them, even if you do use a tool like Whirlpool or something like that. So you said there, these sats are likely going to be more valuable. I also agree with you. I think that these sats are going to be, some people say, oh, it's worth 5% or 10% premium if you're going to an ATM or buying no KYC. I actually think, if we look at this in the long term, we go maybe 10 years out or 20 years out, they're probably going to be worth double or triple. That's how I feel because, what are you going to be able to do if a lot of this gets captured and the KYC creep gets worse and you have this whole blacklisting and whitelisting stuff? You're going to have a load of sats that can only be used between approved users and on Coinbase and all this sort of bullshit. And then you're going to have the real Bitcoin, and those are going to be a hell of a lot more valuable. Is that something that you're calculating in? Therefore, you're not too worried about the cost?
Absolutely. That's a great point. At the end of the day, it was a great example is that Canadian trucker protest. The idea that a civilized place like Canada, who you would have never imagined would enforce inactions like that against their own citizens to restrict payments, that happened last year, and without any hesitation, the government did that. And it's not far off to say that, if any other type of protest were to come about in the US or the UK, that wouldn't happen here. So at the end of the day, there's definitely many reasons as to why you want to get non KYC Bitcoin, and mining is the easiest way to dollar cost average into it. Even if it's not the most competitive rates, and you can afford not to sell your Bitcoin to, acquire these coins. I think at the end of the day that makes the most sense, especially, for myself. My wife and I just had our first kid. He's 4 months, and part of his retirement now is I got a little ledger for him it has some
nice
some sats going to on a regular basis. And
awesome.
That to him, he has no idea what that is now, and hopefully 10, 15 years down the road, or when he's out of college or high school, he can look back and he has this money under the bed, so to speak, and he doesn't need to report to any government agency. I don't know where the world's going to be like in 10, 15 years from now. Hopefully everything's fine, but everyone has to do their part to make sure that they're secure no matter what way regulation goes. So and it's like whatever that value you put on that coin and that privacy, I think, like you said, it's going to be way more than 10, 15%, especially if these requirements to, KYC and track all these coins in the future gets implemented. I think this is going to be almost invaluable, and you'll probably see coins trading 2 or 3 times what the market value is.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then on the other hand is like, even if you make that bet, and I think you're right, but even if, say, we're wrong and there is no difference in value, and you effectively financially, technically, you'd have been better off just buying on an exchange, which I don't think is going to be the case. But if it was, then you still are making sure that you help decentralize the network. You're still doing something to improve Bitcoin security. And yeah, you could say, well, you should only be doing what's best financially for yourself. But I don't actually agree with that. I think that, this movement is more than just making as much money as possible. This is really about trying to make some change and trying to take power away from governments who are doing the disgusting things they're doing around the world. And so if you believe that, then probably the best thing that you can do is to mine at home. And so, that's a big part of why we're doing this month is like, you've got so many people who are spending their whole lives on Bitcoin Twitter and talking about all the different ways that Bitcoin is better than other money and why it's so important. But it's like, well, maybe your time would be better spent actually building something and actually mining
Right.
at home. That's how I feel anyway. Like I feel, I've spent a lot of time talking about it and learning about it. And, I'm sure it's the same with you. You get to a point where you go, it's hard for me to be more bullish. It's hard for me to think that there's a better system than there is now. So there comes a point where listening to another podcast talk about why this is better money, why it's going to go to $1 million a coin, blah, 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 is like, you're probably just actually stroking your ego here and just telling yourself how smart you are, where you would be better off building.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the bear market's a great time to see, who's actually building and who is just riding the bullish bandwagon and talking about price the entire time. This is not my first bear market now, and you definitely see the characters come and go who just were all superficial, and then the ones that
Yeah.
were silent or actually
Yeah.
putting their head down and building. They'll be the ones in the next bull market where people are looking up to. And I'm not to say that that's where I myself or any of the plebs that are trying to do. At the end of the day, mining in itself is hard work. For anyone that thinks it's just plug and play, it's really not. It's sure if you want to mine with Compass and do that, whatever, man. If you want to
Don't
do
do
that,
that.
that's fine by you.
Don't do
But
that.
yeah,
Don't do that.
that's
Trust
like a
me,
huge
don't do that.
risk. So anything that's worth it is hard work, and this is a perfect time where people are going to put their head down and actually get to work and build things. And yeah, I've been on Bitcoin Twitter long enough to see figureheads come and go, and it really is disappointing when you just see the same talking points over and over. Like, yeah, Michael Saylor's great, he's just buying the dip, whatever. But it's like, dude, that's all you ever do. You're just kind of pumping your own bags. Like, what? How are you contributing, or how are these other like anons out there just shit posting the entire time? Like, what are you actually doing to improve the network, to secure the network? Like, are you running a node? Like, come on, man. Like, shit posting is fun, but let's actually build something while we're here.
Yeah, exactly. It's why I spend so much time with the privacy guys and more of the miners and people like that. It's because it's where I can actually learn. I get to spend time around people who are doing things that I don't yet understand how to do or do as well as they do. And so having these sort of conversations allows me to improve. And you're right, listening to Michael Saylor talk, it's fine. And he's a very, very good salesman. But there comes a point where it's like, you just don't need to hear it again. You really don't need to hear it again. You know where this thing's going. And if you know where this thing's going, then try and improve it. Even if you're listening to that and you're just improving your security setup or improving your privacy or whatever it is you're doing, it's like you should at the end of that month or the end of that year think, okay, I've taken a step forward, and not just tell everyone around me a load of stuff that sounds smart and say, thermodynamics or say something like that. It's like, well, that's not actually useful. So for anyone who's listening to this, what are your tips or like things to avoid? Because people are going to be listening to this and considering getting into mining. That's what the whole month is about. Like, are there any things that now you look back on and you think, I wish I'd have known? Like, if you had one tip that you really would want to drill into people, what would that be?
Yeah, well, my background in general is in construction, and per academia, I have my mechanical engineering degree. So I felt pretty equipped to tackle this challenge of, setting up a mine at home. And then, we can talk about this later, but I plan on building out a bigger facility here in Arizona. And, at the end of the day, whether you're doing it on a small scale, like 1 or 2 miners at your house, or you're trying to do something big, it's hard work. That's what makes Bitcoin great, is you literally proof of work. And I think mining is the epitome of that. You literally have to, if you want to run a miner, especially these new gen S19s, or newer, you need to get the electrical infrastructure all set up. You got to make sure that you're going to be able to manage the heat. And even then, you're constantly troubleshooting if you don't get the right hash board working or something like that. It's not easy work. And that's one thing that a lot of people, I think, got into this space within the past year, just hoping to just plug something up and it runs, and then bam, they realize, oh, I got to deal with the heat, or now I got to deal with the noise. And it just kind of puts people off when they weren't anticipating all this extra work that's involved. So yeah, if you're going to get involved in this industry, it's proof of work, man. You got to be able to buckle down and take on issues that will arise, and address them and get over them, and then move on to the next phase of it. And whatever your ambitions are, if you're just looking to DCA, or you want those non KYC coins, yeah, it's going to be work. So don't go in thinking that it's going to be easy just to set up a miner. And that's one of the things that, unfortunately, people ran to Compass for, and now it's biting them in the ass.
Yeah.
You've had, I know so many people that decided, oh, well, I could buy miners and invest in the electrical infrastructure at home and do that, but I think I'm just go with this easy, turnkey solution. And yeah, nothing in life that's worth it is easy. And that's kind of what we saw.
For free.
And so hopefully now you're going to see this more localization of whether it's hosting or just mining at home again. I think that's going to come to more fruition, and hopefully we'll take away some of the power that's been given to these bigger bigger miners, and people are going to do things on a more local scale. And that's kind of one of the things that I'm working on right now, is even though it's going to be really hard to get this up and running, getting a hosting facility out here in Arizona, so that my fellow plebs out here, at least in the southwestern region, can actually come to my facility and say, look at their miners, make sure it's running, and that's theirs. And it's not all the way across states or in Russia or some shit like that was sold to them by Compass.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the draw for a lot of people was there. It was like you said, it's simple. You plug it in, and people are thinking, oh, it's a big company, so it's safe. And then you have other people like me who was like, oh, I don't think I actually really trust them that much, but I can't plug a machine in the UK without coming up with some elaborate and really clever scheme to reuse the heat and everything else, because the costs of the energy are just so high that you really do have to be talking about 2-3x the value, because it's just, it's ridiculous to do it. And so I took the punt and I got fucked. And so, I have to learn from that and go, you're an idiot, you fucked up, and you have to accept that. And then going forward, you have to find smart ways around it. And so it's interesting to hear that you're thinking about setting up something bigger and that people can actually use a hosting facility, because I think that's a much nicer model, because you've got, this trusted pleb network of miners and people who know each other. After a certain amount of time, they build up a reputation. I would have much more trust in the people who I know in this, through Twitter I've been speaking to for years, or, people like John or whoever it is who are being able to host. You feel a lot more comfortable with that. And like you said, you can actually go and see and check that the facility is good. And it's some sort of middle ground, I guess. But what sort of capacity are you looking at?
Now that you've gone, if you don't mind, that you've kind of gone through this process of, especially being out in the UK with the high energy rates, and going with Compass, and then, getting screwed, what are your thoughts? Like, how do you see yourself pursuing mining if you do think that's feasible for you? Because, there's a lot of people in your situation too, whether they're here in the States or abroad.
Yeah, so for me personally, I was at the time in a weird position where I said, I'm never going to buy from an exchange again. My previous business was property, and I sold off all my property to buy Bitcoin. So I was like, I'm done. I'm not. This is not what I want to be investing in anymore. I want Bitcoin, but I don't want to be. I don't want to be buying from exchange anymore, and liquidity on BISC and HODL HODL and through like the pleb networks wasn't enough. So I was like, this was back in, when was it, June of last year, where I was like, I want to be buying here when you had that mass exodus from China, and I was like, this seems like a good time. Let me at least just buy a couple of miners, and I'll do it through Compass, and I'll take the risk. And so, yeah, that's sort of in the past. That's not something I would do again. Going forward, I would like, even though the costs are so high here, I would like to try and set something up just to learn at least. So I've been sort of dotting around like sofa surfing for over a year now, not really had anywhere solid to set anything up. It's been a bit of a pain in the arse, to be honest. But I should be moving into something in the next sort of few months. So my plan is to actually have something set up in the garage, just something basic like running one miner, and just do a bit of testing and play around and have that as my sort of DCA and a way for me to learn. I don't think it's going to be the most cost-effective thing, but it's a way for me to learn. And what I'm suggesting to a lot of other UK plebs is, one, if you have a business, to consider if you need some heat to run a miner and then offset that cost against your tax, because then effectively that is free energy. So anyone who's running a business should seriously consider that. And then anybody who hasn't really got any respect for the laws, they should consider being a little bit of a pirate and seeing if they can have a setup where, again, they get some free energy. But outside of that, I think Europe is pretty difficult.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you're actually still trying to pursue it, even if it is from, not as profitable of a standpoint, but at the end of the day, you got to secure the network somehow. And it's
Exactly.
a great way to, test and learn firsthand. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just, it's such a big and important part of Bitcoin. And I feel like, I want to experience it. And I know there are such incredible people in this space. And well, you can see now, like John said to me, this mining conference didn't work. And I said, can we do something on Ungovernable Misfits? He's like, yeah, cool. Puts out a message, just to say, like, to all you guys, would you spend some time to help other plebs and spread the message and help people learn, and just look at what's happened. Like, you've all come up, you're all having conversations, you're all helping people, and the generosity with people's time is just mind-blowing. So I'm just excited to dive in and start learning.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I got a little bit of your interview with Tech Engineer. Guy sounds great, man. Like, I haven't really stayed in touch with a lot of the plebs. Like I said, I have a 4-month-old at home, so it's been a little hard to stay on top of anything on Bitcoin Twitter lately. But no, man, it's great. All the resources that everyone's pulling together to get this done is awesome. And thank you for hosting this too. I'm glad that it wasn't just stuck at the mining conference, and John was able to, and you were able to put this together to move forward. But yeah, man, as far as, what I see the future of, Bitcoin mining turning into is, I really hope, just like myself, even if it's a small mom and pop shop, like, if people could start figuring out ways that they can host for friends and family, that's like the best solution. We're still decentralized in network, and maybe someone that is a little more tech savvy or has the capabilities to, run a couple miners for their family or friends. That's the way to do it. That's how I kind of see this whole evolution of home mining turning into. Because yeah, like I said, it's a lot of work to get this stuff done. But if you have a little bit of know-how, get a couple miners and outlets hooked up, and if you have family and friends that want to get involved, yeah, host them at your house or garage or something like that. You know what I mean? It's a great way to get people involved. Matter of fact, last year when I was getting into this, I had some family members that wanted to get, into mining, and so I pretty much kind of walked hand in hand with them as far as the miner procurement, because it's really hard to buy miners, at least from someone that you could trust. So, I went as far as driving out to Wisconsin or flying out to Wisconsin to meet my vendor at that time. And so I managed to procure some miners from my friends and family, and we got 8 machines up and running. And they haven't looked back since. And once you get past those hurdles of trying to figure out what exactly is required to get this machine up and running, do all the networking that's involved. After that, it's kind of plug and play. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of miner management, but other than that, if you can get family and friends involved, a lot of these plebs out there have a lot of know-how. So, that's kind of a call to action to see if you can get your other family members at least understanding about what Bitcoin mining truly is. And if you can host, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, as not that many people are using solar, is do you have any advice for people who are considering putting in a solar system and considering using it for mining? Any advice on either like the type of solar panels or the type of setup, or anything to avoid, or anything like that? Because there's not that many people mining with solar that I've spoken to.
Right. So I think the biggest thing is kind of like the barrier to entry. It definitely is more of an upfront cost to do the solar system. There's a lot of financing options out there, and fortunately, I got a decent terms on mine. So it, on a month-to-month basis, made sense to move forward with the solar system that I got. But even more so, like if you have to also buy battery equipment, the upfront costs are going to be quite expensive. But if you can check all those boxes and it financially makes sense for you, at the end of the day, you're going to oversize your equipment way more than what your household ever consumes. But unfortunately, you're never going to size your equipment big enough to completely offset your miner. These machines are just powerhouses running 24/7. So at the end of the day, it's don't expect to completely cover your expenses with solar unless you have a lot of land and you can put a lot of panels out there. And at the same time, it's going to be quite costly to get the batteries to store it if you do oversize your equipment more than what your miners pull, because it is this fine balancing act where you only have so much sun in a day throughout the day to actually produce, and then during the off-peak hours, either you have a ton of batteries to offset that, or you're just mining straight from the grid. But at the end of the day, from a sustainability standpoint, whether prices go up or down in your jurisdiction, at the end of the day, if you're mining during the time that your solar panels are producing, that's straight sun to miner energy right there. So to me, it made sense. You obviously have to adjust to your own situation and wherever you're sourcing your panels and batteries if you choose to go that route. But at the end of the day, just know that, it's not going to 100% cover your cost to mine. And you just got to make sure that you're nimble, whether you want to do some curtailing methods with your miners, turning them off, turning them on during on and off peak hours, really just actively managing it, or you just choose to run it 24/7, and then during the off peak hours, when the sun's down, just use the grid and just keep going. So yeah, that's not a whole lot to it. At the end of the day, I know Tech Engineer has come up or is utilizing some controllers, I believe, to kind of manage his battery solar panel system as well. So he's probably another great resource to look into. Other than that, it's just more or less plug and play. You get the panels up, they only run certain hours of the day, and then that's when you really are your most cost effective at mining.
Yeah, that's great advice. And then the other thing is, you'd mentioned obviously doing a setup for hosting. Obviously, there will be people who will listen to this and they literally cannot set up a miner. There will be people who either travel constantly for work and they haven't got anywhere to actually physically house one of these things, or for whatever reason, there will be people out there. So this idea of having smaller hosting facilities through like trusted networks and stuff like that, although the absolute best thing is to have your miner housed at your home and you're completely in control of it, there is this
Absolutely.
middle ground where it's like, well, it's not at home, but it's not at some fucking dumpster fire like Compass. There's like this, there's this middle ground where it's like, well, you're still decentralizing the network, because I know that, you know, if someone's got a miner with you or John or someone like that, you're not going to be saying, let me make sure that I can put these UTXOs on a blacklist and let me comply with every single thing ahead of time, because that's what I'm going to do and be a good little boy. Like, you're going to do what you can to try and make sure this network stays decentralized and to protect people. So can you tell me a little bit more about your plans with that? Like, how big a facility are you going for? Like, what's the time frame? Are you doing that with solar as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the project has definitely evolved. I got started with the concept of this back in December of last year, and more or less it's evolved from trying to build out a 2 to 3 megawatt facility. Now it's kind of scaled down to 1 to 2 megawatts, and it's going to be a mix of solar tied into the grid as well as an immersion system. And
Okay.
we're doing the immersion out here mainly because of the heat. It's just, to be able to have the same type of uptime, 24/7, 365 during peak summer out here is nearly impossible without immersion. I've done several different ways in calcs of trying to figure out, well, maybe we can do an evap, evaporative method for, the big curtain walls that you see at like Riot's Windstone facility out in Texas, but you just deal with a lot of humidity out there. And to be frank, water consumption is a huge issue out here in the southwest of Arizona. I think we've been in a 20-year drought. Um, you can look at the pictures of Lake Mead, the water levels are down. So water consumption is a huge factor for me. So we threw out the idea of using cooling tower and are looking towards doing an adiabatic cooling system tied into the immersion system. And that's probably going to be the most effective way to be able to maintain uptime, during peak summer. And then during the winter time, we won't have to utilize water to pre-cool the air going into the dry cooling setup. So that's kind of the preliminary plan, about 1 to 2 megawatts. And the idea is to utilize this site as more or less as a test facility to see how scalable it is to do it out in Arizona. And the reason why I'm doing it out in Arizona rather than setting up shop in a cooler climate is the barrier to entry is really tough. If we can manage to make Arizona work and be a profitable hosting facility, and I mean profitable for our clients too. We don't want someone to be paying 14 cents a kilowatt hour, right, at hosted rates, and they have all this money and equipment invested and they're not profitable, right? At the end of the day, it has to be a competitive market. So it's definitely been quite the challenge, considering I'm essentially by myself on this project. I got some family and friends that went on a plot of land, so we ended up buying 4 acres right by a nuclear power plant out here in Arizona. So our land is literally right up against the substation that's tied into Palo Verde nuclear power plant. So it has a cool vibe to it out there, and we are hoping to break ground in the next 2 to 3 months. But it's definitely going a lot slower than we had anticipated. Equipment is just extremely backlogged, and then once we are up and running, the idea is to host probably for the first megawatt, it's going to be about 135. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me think about the calcs again. It's going to be closer to 200 miners, allowing for overclock as well. So yeah, it's definitely in the works, and right now it's coming along. Definitely wish it could be a lot smoother, but I just need to find a rich uncle that has a couple of $1 million to drop on this.
Well, that sounds awesome. I'd love in the future when you're a little bit further along with it to have another chat, have you back on the pod and see where you're at. I had a question just as you were talking about it. I was thinking, what about security? Like, how does that work? How are you thinking about that? Because presumably when you're doing a mining setup like this, you've got to think about like, okay, if we've got 200 miners being set up in here, what if we're attacked? how do you work with that? Do you think about like just, oh, we have insurance, or do you just sit out there with enough guns that anyone would be stupid to try it?
Well, fortunately, we're in Arizona, so there's plenty of guns out here. But on a more serious note, no, there's definitely a lot of security measures we would put in place, from remote alarming, disarming, that kind of stuff. Fortunately, being right next to a nuclear power plant, you can see all the different types of monitoring systems that are out by the substation we're located, as well as we're right next to a firehouse too. So it's although we're pretty remote, we're right next to some critical infrastructure, so that's going to be a deterrent in itself. And then as far as actually securing the property, we're going to put up secure fencing, camera systems, that kind of stuff. Considered the idea of doing more or less 24/7 security, but that's still kind of we're playing with the numbers to see if that makes sense. And then there are many ways to track to the equipment going in and out of the facility. Fortunately, with an immersion system, it's nobody really likes to get their hands messy, dipping their hands in oil, that kind of stuff. But we can definitely put RFID trackers, so that way we know when equipment's moving inside the facility, that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, the whole purpose of this is to kind of localize hosting. So my house is 20, 25 minutes away. So I can easily get to that facility at a moment's notice. On top of if there is already some personnel at that center, the idea is to have at least constant personnel there.
Cool. Well, listen, it's been awesome chatting to you. We definitely will do this again. Thank you for all your involvement in this month. I'm sure we're going to be having some panels. We're going to be having all sorts of questions coming in and everything else. So I'm sure we will speak again during the month. But it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you. And I'm excited to hear about this facility and how it all plays out.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Max. It's been a blast, and I'll make sure to get some better audio equipment next time we hop on. So, best of luck editing. I hope this is doable for you.
Thank you, mate. All right, we'll speak soon. Cheers.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions at all about home mining, please do reach out. We've got the whole team on Twitter. You can use the hashtag PlebMinerMonth. And make sure not to miss any of these amazing giveaways. We have an S9 being given away today, and we have something every single day of the month. For all the info, go to ungovernablemisfits.com, and we look forward to hearing from you.